Now you've learned about Keynesian fiscal policy and also about how John Maynard Keynes, how and why he objected to the classical model and why he felt like intervention was important. So what we're going to do in this lesson is take a look at some of the critics and some of the flaws in Keynesian fiscal policy. So first I want to look back to what exactly it is that Keynes had in mind and why he believed it was going to work. So Keynes believed that aggregate supply was a lot more what he called sticky, right, than what classical economists believed. So he believed that aggregate supply was not flexible, right, all the way down, but that it in fact was sticky or inflexible. So we had kind of a straight line for aggregate supply here. So in the case of a recession, let's imagine that this is the long run aggregate supply curve for a moment. And let's imagine that before the recession, we were at aggregate demand 2. So everything is good, everything's going along well. And then something happens like the stock market crash or the housing crisis, something happens to start a recession, and aggregate demand actually falls to the left. So Keynes believed that when that happened, that wages and prices wouldn't fall, or at least it would take a long time before they would, and therefore the self-correction wouldn't happen. And instead you'd just end up stuck over here with a really low level of output, right? A really low current GDP and a huge recessionary gap. And he believed that you could increase spending, right? In this case, let's imagine that we have an MPC of 0.75 and a multiplier of 4, and we have this $20 billion GDP gap. So he believed, $5 billion in spending, right, with the multiplier process ends up shifting aggregate demand over here and causes no inflation because wages and prices are sticky. So there wouldn't be any increase in the price level immediately. So this is, as I have a little picture over here of Keynes dancing, right? This is exactly what he had in mind. This is how he thought things would work. So what's wrong with that picture? Well, critics of Keynes say there's a number of flaws to fiscal policy. You can see the title of that book, Where Keynes Went Wrong. We're going to go through a few of them in detail and a few of them pretty quickly. Crowding out is one of the big ones. Okay, and crowding in. Crowding out applies to as a flaw for expansionary policy and crowding in for contractionary policy. Also, the net export effect, which is the impact on exports that his policies cause, the potential for his policies to cause inflation. Timing is always an issue, and politics, and the fact that his policies are not necessarily consistently implemented. And the final flaw is that his policy does not offer a response to stagflation. So let's look closely, especially at crowding out, crowding in, and the net export effect. So if you look at this particular graph, you should right away be able to see on the left, this is an economy in a recession, right? Their current level of output, if this is Y star, right, and they're at Y1, we definitely see a recessionary gap. So Keynes would say what we need to do is we need to increase government spending or cut taxes. So let's say we increase government spending. We do not change taxes. Okay, taxes stay the same. We shift aggregate demand, right, and everything's going along great, except remember how we had to borrow this money. Right? We had to borrow the money because we're not raising taxes. Well, borrowing the money, and we'll analyze this a little more closely in Unit 4, but borrowing the money, when the government's borrowing, it drives up interest rates. Right? When the government starts borrowing, interest rates go up. So let's imagine, we'll just pick up a spot here and say this was the existing amount of investment in the economy. Well, when interest rates go up because of Keynes's policy, now we will have less investment, right? And that's what crowding out means. It means the government's spending money. That's great, stimulating the economy, but because of the increase in interest rates, investment spending falls, and investment spending, of course, is also an AD shifter. So aggregate demand is going to shift back to the left. Now, where is it going to end up? That's the real question, right? Is it going to shift a little bit to the left? Is it going to shift all the way back to where it was? We don't really know. If it shifts all the way back, we would call that complete crowding out. And if that happened, then there's no point to the policy. If it shifts a little bit back, we would call that incomplete crowding out, and there would still be a benefit to the policy. Okay, but crowding out is when the government's action displaces private sector spending. We can also look at this as a flowchart. So we can see that the recession causes us to implement an expansionary fiscal policy. That policy shifts aggregate demand to the right, whether it's because of an increase in government spending or because taxes went down and we had an increase in consumption. Okay, that increase in aggregate demand drives up our deficit. The deficit drives up interest rates. Interest rates decrease investment. And as a result, our aggregate demand goes back down, which is the opposite of what we wanted. So we can probably figure out what crowding in is, right? We have a period of inflation. We use a contractionary fiscal policy. That causes aggregate demand to go down. And guess what happens? Our deficit is reduced, or we even run a surplus. When we have a lower deficit or we have a surplus, guess what happens to interest rates? That additional money that's available is going to cause interest rates to go down, which then causes investment to go up, causing our aggregate demand to increase at a time when we were trying to decrease it, right? So again, that's going to be a flaw in our fiscal policy. Now let's look at another one of the flaws in fiscal policy. This one is the net export effect. And the net export effect is in some ways very similar to the crowding out effect. So if you look at the flowchart on the left, you see we have a problem of recession and slow growth. We use an expansionary fiscal policy, which of course is going to result in shifting aggregate demand to the right. And as we saw with crowding out, we're going to have higher domestic interest rates. But this time, instead of talking about what's going to happen with investment, right, which was the crowding out effect, instead we're going to go back to that issue of currency exchange. We're going to see demand for the US dollar increase. Why? Because people want to put their money in our banks because our banks are paying higher rates of interest, which is going to drive up the value of the US dollar, and unfortunately, it's going to cause our net exports to decrease. And because that's a component of aggregate demand will decrease again. So, again, we have used an expansionary fiscal policy to try to solve the problem of recession. We've tried to increase aggregate demand, and in doing so, we've driven up interest rates. That increase in interest rates has decreased investment, which is the crowding out effect, and it's also decreased net exports, which is the net export effect. So we have two drawbacks right there to the fiscal policy. On the contractionary side, we're fighting the problem of inflation, so we're using a contractionary fiscal policy and trying to take some steps to decrease aggregate demand, whether that is raising taxes or cutting government spending. This leads to lower domestic interest rates, and as we saw with crowding in, that causes investment to go up. That's one problem, the crowding in effect, but it also causes decreased demand for our currency. People don't want to put their money in our banks, our currency depreciates, our net exports increase, right? And that and investment, they're both going counter to the goal we had for aggregate demand. So you can see that crowding out, crowding in, and the net export effect are all pretty serious flaws depending on the magnitude, right? If there's a huge decrease in aggregate demand, for example, as a result of the expansionary fiscal policy driving up interest rates, then the policy really has no merit whatsoever. If it's just a minor side effect, well then Keynes is probably right. Another flaw in fiscal policy is simply the timing. Fiscal policy is often used at when it's actually too late to help anymore. So here's the business cycle. We're in a trough, we're starting to experience an expansion, right? And then we hit a peak and we start to go into a recession. Well, as soon as we start to go into the recession, like right here, right, that's the appropriate place for an interventionist expansionary fiscal policy, right? Right here, we should be doing something like cutting taxes. But in order to get that tax cut passed, we have to have Congress on board, we have to have the president on board, they have to meet, they have to work out, whatever 100-page document they have, vote for it. Well, by the time it gets passed, we're frequently much further down the road, we could even be at the point where it's about to turn around. Now, obviously, in something like the Great Depression or even the recent Great Recession, there was plenty of time to act because the problems were pretty serious. But sometimes it just takes too long. Another problem is that politicians do not like contractionary policies ever. Nobody ever wants to say, I'm going to raise your taxes or I'm going to cut spending. So contractionary policies are politically unpopular, which means that in every election year, everybody is promoting expansionary policies. So that's great if we're in a recession. But if we're actually in this part of the business cycle and things are growing great, and then somebody gets elected and they cut taxes, that's exactly the wrong thing to do. And they're doing it because it's politically popular, but not because it's economically the right solution. Of course, another problem is stagflation, right? We've looked at stagflation a few times. That is caused generally by an increase in resource prices, like the price of gas, right? When the price of gas went up in the 1970s, that impacted pretty much every industry in the United States. Short-run aggregate supply shifted to the left. We had higher prices and we had lower levels of output, and Keynesian fiscal policy offers no solutions. If you try to increase aggregate demand, right, try to use that policy, then you've just increased inflation. If you try to decrease aggregate demand, you've just increased unemployment. So there's really no good solution offered. And that's why Keynes actually fell out of favor in the 1970s, because people started feeling like, well, he doesn't offer any actual solutions. So that's the end of our list of problems, but I do want to talk just for a moment about this issue of state and local pro-cyclical behavior. So if you think about the business cycle, and let's go back to the business cycle slide. We'll erase some of these things. If you look at the business cycle, really the point of Keynesian fiscal policy is to smooth out the business cycle. So we don't have the really high highs, we don't have the really low lows, right? So Keynesian fiscal policy is intending to sort of keep this kind of more mellow, right? Make the ride a little less bumpy. Okay, so the problem is that for example, during a period of recession, Keynes would say, cut taxes, increase spending, do what you can to keep this from getting too low. But because most state governments, actually possibly all state governments, but certainly ours, have a balanced budget requirement, that means they can't use expansionary fiscal policy, right? So if, for example, during a period of recession, if their tax revenues decline, they can't just keep spending money. They actually have to cut spending as well. So what happens is, in a period of recession, tax revenues are declining. State governments say, let's cut spending. Let's cut our government spending. Well, what that does is it actually makes matters worse, right? So while the federal government is trying to implement Keynesian fiscal policy to solve the recession, state governments, by law, are essentially taking steps that make it worse. So we have one force trying to smooth things out, we have the other one trying to make things bumpier, and we end up kind of making no progress whatsoever. So it's something to consider, the fact that this balanced budget requirement, it may be a good thing, right? Because as we've seen, politicians frequently use expansionary fiscal policy even when they shouldn't. And so it's probably good to have the reins in at least part of our government so that that doesn't happen. But unfortunately, during a period of recession, for example, in the most recent recession, while the federal government was increasing government spending, right, and cutting taxes, doing exactly what Keynesian policy says it should do, most states were cutting government spending and increasing taxes. So it's hard to make much progress when your two levels of government are working at cross purposes. So that will conclude for now our look at the flaws of fiscal policy.